Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 5th meeting of the Planning and Environment Committee. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats of communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. To make a request specific to this meeting, please contact pec@london.ca. So moving along, we'll go to any disclosures of pecuniary interest. I see none. I will now go to the consent items. Are there any items that the committee would like to remove? I see none. Just to go over the consent items, there are a number of holding provisions as well as the Building Division monthly report, as well as I'd like to draw the committee members' attention to the latch report that is attached to the end of our agenda. There are a number of items in the consent item, as well as in the scheduled items, that relate to the latch report. And I'd just like to go over them with committee members. 2.3 is 2.1 in the latch report. 2.4 is 5.1 in the latch report. 2.5 is 3.7 in the latch report. 2.7 is 3.9. 3.1 is 5.2, and 3.2 is 5.4 of the latch report. So I'd just like to bring those items to the committee members' attention. Before I move forward with a motion to receive the consent items, I would like to, first of all, congratulate our new Deputy City Mayor, Planning and Economic Development, Mr. Scott Mathers. I know he is here this evening joining us, and I understand this is his first Planning and Environment Committee meeting under his new position. Welcome, Mr. Mathers. So with that, I'm looking for a mover of consent items. Councillor Lehman, seconded by Councillor Hillier. And are there any questions that members may have? Councillor Lehman.
Just a comment on 2.3 on 472 Richmond Street. We can see the value of heritage here. The fence, well, it was an excellent report. I learned a lot about that property and, you know, that fabulous church that goes all the way back to the 1800s history on that location. And, you know, through such a, you know, hundreds of years, 100 years of being a, you know, focal point of London. And you can, again, the value of that perimeter fencing, which is, adds so much to that property. I'm glad we're able to move that and keep that in whole and repair it, because it looks like it's been, has seen better days. So very, very good report, and I appreciate the read.
Thank you, Councillor Lehman. Is there any other comments from committee members? I see none. I wonder if the committee will allow me just to inquire on a couple consent items. The first one is 2.2. I've got a question to staff regarding the development charge claimable works for Sunningdale Court subdivision. And the estimate is a little bit higher than what is allowed. And given that there were a number of bids and it still exceeded the lowest bid, I would like to ask staff if if this is something we're going to see more and more often as costs increase and the need for construction keeps going. So if I could go to staff.
Well, thank you through you, Madam Chair. So this is both surprising and unsurprising given the current economic conditions. You'll see that there's two projects that are being requested for additional funding. One is 35% over the cost estimate. The other is 65% over the cost estimate, which are considerably higher than we would anticipate. However, it was a competitive tender process with 3 bids, and that was the lowest bid. We do note that the development charges rates for 2022 have increased by the index, which was considerable this year to help address cost increases that we are anticipating. This is something we're going to be monitoring closely, and we'll be looking at whether or not it makes sense to come to committee and council with a more global approach to addressing some of these potential cost issues as well. But I will note that you do have a good control mechanism in place with the source of financing approach that we've introduced for claims versus the old urban works approach to make sure the BC Reserve funds can accommodate increases where appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Yeoman, for that explanation. I think being on the committee here, it's important that we understand the development charges and increases that can be expected as we move forward with construction, which is also needed in our city. And with that, I would like to, I know we've got a motion on the floor for the consent items. I understand that there is no longer going to be a delegation from EPAC, and I would like to bring that up to the consent items as well. There is an added presentation on the agenda, but there is no delegation request. So if the committee would allow me to do that, I've got some nods. I don't have anyone having concerns, just bringing it up to the consent items as opposed to having it as a scheduled item, since there'll be no delegation request with the report. So with that, we have all the consent items and a motion, and we've added the 3.4 delegation, which no longer is existing, but we do have the report. And with that, we can proceed to vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
So moving along to our for this evening is 3.1, which is a public participation meeting regarding the demolition request by Woodland Cemetery for the former gatehouse and maintenance garage on the heritage listed property at 493 Springbank Drive. I'm looking for a mover to open the public participation. Councillor Hillier, seconded by Councillor Turner.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
If I could just go to staff for just a very quick verbal.
Hi there, Madam Chair. This is Michael Bregwell, Heritage Planner. I can provide a brief introduction to this.
Yes, please proceed.
Okay, thank you. This is a demolition request for the heritage listed property at 493 Springbank Drive, which is otherwise known as Woodland Cemetery. The Woodland Cemetery property is listed on the Register of Cultural Heritage Resources, as all cemeteries in London are, and has been a site of Woodland Cemetery since the 1870s. The demolition request pertains specifically to the former gatehouse and the garage just inside the gates, accessed from Springbank Drive. And just a few notes on the property for the benefit of the committee. Woodland Cemetery was first established in this location in the 1870s. And prior to this, earlier versions of the cemetery were located in St. Paul's Cathedral downtown, and later in what is now Queen's Park at the Western Fair. There's a number of monuments and structures of note located within the Woodland Cemetery, including the Annie Pixley Fulford Mausoleum, which was London's first privately owned mausoleum. It was designed by a London firm of Moore and Henry, and also includes some statues that were sculpted by Walter Allward, one of Canada's greatest sculptors. And there's also a 1920 public mausoleum, which was the first public mausoleum in London. As note, though, the demolition request at present is for the former gatehouse and the garage. Both structures were constructed in the late 1940s and early 1950s during a period of administrative and infrastructure improvements for the cemetery. The gatehouse is a vernacular two-story dwelling, primarily used for administrative offices, and the garage was constructed around the same time and consists of a single-story buff brick structure. A written intent to demolish the two buildings was received on January 24th, 2022, and a demolition request for a building or structure on a heritage listed property triggers a formal 60-day review process, which includes consultation with the latch. That took place on February 9th, a public participation meeting at the Planning Environment Committee, and council decision. That whole period expires on March 25th, 2022. A preliminary evaluation of the property according to the criteria of Ontario Regulation 906 was completed for this demolition request. And it's apparent that the Woodland Cemetery certainly does have cultural heritage value or interest based on the preliminary evaluation. However, the gatehouse and the garage were not identified as heritage attributes. So the staff recommendation is to consent to the demolition request for the former gatehouse and the garage, with it being noted that the property still retains potential cultural heritage value or interest and should remain on the Register of Cultural Heritage Resources. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gull. Any technical questions from committee? I see none. So I will move to the public. If there's anyone here that would like to speak to this recommendation. And I'll ask one more time if anyone would like to make comments to the recommendation. I hear and see none, so with that, I will go to committee members to close the public participation meeting. Councillor Hillier, seconded by Councillor Lewis. And if we can proceed to vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
And I have committee members for a motion, comments. Is there anyone that would like to make a comment? Councillor Lewis?
Not a comment, Madam Chair. I'm just prepared to move the staff recommendation.
We have a motion, a seconder from Councillor Hillier. And with that, we are going to be consenting to the demolition of the former gatehouse and the maintenance garage on the property. Just from the chair, I'd just like to make the comment. I'm very familiar with this cemetery. It's not too far from where I live, and really appreciate the fact that it's going to retain its potential cultural heritage designation on the register. So with that, we can proceed to vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries.
Moving along to our next schedule, 3.2, and it is a public participation meeting. It's a request to remove the property from the Register of Cultural Heritage Resources by Auburn Developments for the property at 2631 Hyde Park Road and 1521 Sunningdale Road West. Looking to committee members to open up the public participation meeting. Councillor Lehman, seconded by Councillor Turner.
Councillor Hillier. Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
And I understand that there is a, on this, I would like to go to staff.
Thank you. This is Michael Gregwell, Heritage Planner again. I've got a brief presentation, and there's a few slides that are attached to the added agenda. They begin on page 217 of the added agenda. So this is a request to remove the property at 2631 Hyde Park Road and 1521 Sunningdale Road West from the Register of Cultural Heritage Resources. The property consists of approximately a 50-acre property located at the northeast corner of Hyde Park Road and Sunningdale Road West, consisting primarily of cultivated fields. Just some brief background on the property and its inclusion on the register. The subject property was included within the portion of lands in the former London Township that were annexed in 1993. Shortly after annexation, a Fox Hollow community plan was prepared as a part of an official plan amendment, and the lands were designated and zoned for the sole purpose of cemetery use. Given the intended use in the 1990s as a cemetery, the property was included on the 2006 Inventory of Heritage Resources that was later adopted in 2007 in its entirety, which is now the Register of Cultural Heritage Resources. All cemeteries in London are included on the Register of Cultural Heritage Resources, and the subject property was included on the register as it was intended to be the future site of the Fox Hollow of Mount Pleasant Cemetery, but the property currently has no burials or interments. Due to high groundwater levels that were identified within recent years, the property is no longer intended to be used for cemetery purposes in the future, and a planning application has been received for the property. A request to remove the property from the register was received on January 24th, 2022. And the process to remove a property is similar as the process to demolish a building or a heritage listed structure. So consultation with Latch, public participation meeting at Planning Environment Committee, and council decision. Due to the change in planned use, the property no longer retains potential cultural heritage value or interest. And as noted, there is a draft plan of subdivision for the property. Just as a matter of clarification, the removal of the property from the register is an Ontario Heritage Act application, which is separate from, but in a way related to the planning application. Information on the planning application can be found on page 4 of the slides for the presentation, which I believe is on page 220 of the added agenda. And I believe Mr. Feldberg can speak to some of the planning application if there are specific questions. With regards to the Ontario Heritage Act application, notices were mailed to the property owners within a 120-meter radius, as well as community groups, including the ACO London Region Branch, Middlesex Historical Society, and the Urban League of London. And a latch was also consulted on the application and agreed with the staff recommendation. As the property no longer retains cultural heritage value or interest, the property no longer warrants inclusion on the register, and as a result, the staff recommendation is to remove the property from the Register of Cultural Heritage Resources. And again, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Grigol. Any technical questions from committee members? Councillor Turner.
Just for clarification, this property is part of that discussion that we had about the school site and the land swap for Auburn. Is that correct?
That's right. I'd like to confirm that with staff.
Madam Chair, yes, Councillor, that is part of the Mount Pleasant application that we brought to Planning Committee in May of last year, and then received direction from Council in September of 21 to consider a draft plan application at this property.
Thank you.
Any other technical questions? I'd like to now go to the applicant, if the applicant is here. I'd like to now proceed to the public. If there's anyone here from the public that would like to speak to this recommendation. Yes, sir, welcome. Please state your name, address if you wish, and you have up to 5 minutes. Welcome.
Yes, I'll be very quick. Can you hear me there?
Yes.
My name is Ali Joma. I am representing the owners of the adjacent property, 1431 Sunningdale Road West. And it's adjacent to the property, which is requesting to remove the Register of Property from Cultural Heritage. Our request back in 2012 had been submitted to the city to include the property in the urban growth boundary. And at that time, services had been budgeted to our lands and the parcel of land east of us. The council had agreed to work with the city staff, including members of our development community, to agree to move forward on 3 lands like ours, which were designated as Tier 1 status, because they could immediately be developed with no cost to the city and will bring in great revenues for permits and property taxes. Since then, we have approached the city to continue the approval process and have not succeeded in moving forward. Respected mayor and council members, years have passed where many community members have addressed the concern that London, while limiting access to serviced land available within the city limits, has impacted the growth of the city, as well as the increased revenues that help the city's growth by slowing the progress of development within the city limits. In an article posted today in the London Free Press, it is referring to this issue. It says that this subject has been raised by many individuals and organizations, including the London Development Institute. It mentioned that revenues from new building permits increased by 70%, from 143 million to 257 million in Middlesex Center alone, because developers are given the opportunity to develop in their regions. Our request today, and I'll close here, is to include the whole block of land that runs east of the adjacent 2631 Hyde Park, 1532 Sunningdale, east towards Wonderland, in removing the register of property from cultural heritage resources and speeding up the comprehensive review to review the supply in the north and west of the city, which will not have capacity within 5 years. The OMB has provided a solution without increasing the urban growth boundary through policies that it has approved in November 2019. We would appreciate your attention be drawn on this issue. Thank you for your time and efforts.
Thank you, sir. Is there anyone else that would like to speak to the recommendation to remove the cemetery from the Register of Cultural Heritage Resources? Yes?
Mr. Musa, is this the item you would like to speak to?
I'll ask one more time, and the question from the secretary was if Mr. Musa, if you're listening, if you'd like to speak to this recommendation.
It's *6 to unmute.
Sorry about that. I didn't realize I needed to unmute myself. I thought I was unmuted from there. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Mr. Musa. If you can identify yourself, address if you wish, and you have up to 5 minutes. Please proceed.
Okay. Mohammed Musa, 155 Thornton Ave. Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know where to start with this, but there goes. And please feel free to reel me in, Madam Chair, if I go too far tangential. I'm surprised by this application. My first thoughts are we're putting the cart ahead of the horse. Removing a cultural heritage designation from this property basically brings us to the point of this is a foregone conclusion that committee council is going to approve this for residential. Rezone it. Cemeteries are a very important part of any municipality. I mean, to the point that in 2016, the provincial policy statement said that cemeteries should be protected. It's somewhere in there. If memory serves me correctly, it's policy 1.1.1. Not buried in there. It's pretty important. We've got an application here to remove this you know, ahead of, sorry, a little disjointed here, ahead of a planning application coming forward. This property came into the urban growth boundary through a fight and appeal, I'm not exactly sure how, in Vision 96, based on it being a solely for the use of a cemetery. That is the reason that back in, you know, the 90s, with Vision 96, that this came into it. And here we are, 6 years later, trying to rezone it for residential. And I know what the argument's going to be. We need more residential. It's not an argument that flies with me very well. So my questions are, when's the last time that the City of London, if committee or anybody from committee or staff can let me know, when's the last time that an OS3 property was rezoned to whether it be residential or Ag 1? And has it ever happened in the City of London? Ag 1 or 2, my apologies. The other question is, can we expand that scope and ask how often is this even done in Ontario? Takes me to the next point here. I find it surprising, actually I find it comical, that the water levels are too high for 6-foot burial plots with vaults, yet in a couple of months, a month, 3 months, you guys will be getting an application where 9 and 10 foot footings and and foundation walls are apparently going to be good for this. And as I said, I may be going tangential here. That's another application in itself, but cemeteries need to be protected. This came in under the guise of being a cemetery into our urban growth boundary. So either, as the previous person was talking about, either you add everybody else into the urban growth boundary that didn't quite think of this way of getting into it in the 90s, or you remove it from the urban growth boundary and project it. It was solely for the use of it as a cemetery. And I find it offensive that we're doing this, and this is leading to horse trading, basically, in terms of why we're getting here, why we're at this point.
Mr. Musa, I know you asked me to reel you in, and I'm going to reel you in.
Okay, my apologies.
Nope, you've got about a minute or just less than a minute. But okay. I think personal comments aside, if you can stay with the issues.
I apologize. I'm somewhat frustrated with this. So the water table is apparently too high for cemeteries, for burial plots, but it's not going to be for foundation walls and footings. There was one other point I was going to make, but do we have any geotechnical data to support that there are that the water table is high, or are we just going to take the applicant's word for it? And have any GPR studies been done to show that there are no burial plots? It's very difficult to close a cemetery, even if it is not opened per se.
And Mr. Musa, your time is come.
Okay, my time is up. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and committee and staff. So I just have those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to make a comment to the recommendation in front of us? I hear and see none. I am going to ask one more time if there's anyone that would like to make a comment to the recommendation. I hear and see none, and with that, I'll go to committee to close the PPM. Councillor Lewis, seconded by Councillor Lehman.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
And I'd like to first go to staff to get a response from some of the questions that we've just heard. And we'll start with the first one about the request from the three other owners to designate their properties and add them into the urban growth boundary, or and then following up with Mr. Musa's questions, and I might just go to Mr. Fehlberg on this one to give us a better understanding on the process and how we got here, and then how we're going to move forward with this application. And a couple of the questions were directed to staff about the zoning, if this is very unique to the City of London, as well as to the province of Ontario designating an OS3 and zoning it to AGRA, as well as the concerns around the water table. So if I can go to staff and to address some of the questions that were raised.
Certainly, Madam Chair, and I'll take a stab. And I think I can probably answer both of the questions. Maybe not the specific around the OS3, we might have to take that back for more of a technical review and to see some of the history that we have here locally. But in regards to the first speaker, member of the public, when it comes to the boundary, and as indicated in the article this morning in the Free Press, we maintain an available number of years of supply in the city. And in order for us the city to consider any expansions to that, we take a look at the citywide and we look at that, the amount of supply that we have. But we have to undertake a comprehensive review to do that. So we have to go back, take a look at all the census data, look at the growth allocations, and estimate where or how much supply we have, and then we start to designate where that supply can be placed. Our plan at this point is to report back to this committee later this year, probably early next year, actually next year, once the census data is available and growth allocations can be provided and established, and then start working towards that comprehensive review before we come back to this committee to talk about the available number of residential lots in the city. With regards to the process, so we are still, so the application for draft plan was circulated in December of 2021. The period closed in January, mid to late January. And we've been receiving all the public and stakeholder comments to this point. And we've been working with the applicant on coming up with a draft plan of subdivision. At this point, the plan is to come to this committee in late March or April with the recommendation from staff. And at that point, this committee will have the opportunity to consider that based on the merits of the application. Some of those technical studies that Mr. Musa was identifying, we'd be considering those. We'd be looking at hydrogeological, geotechnical, those types of things in order to establish the development limits. In regards to this particular heritage application, I don't think there was anything there that we needed to address. So I think that pretty much sums up the public questions.
Thank you for that. And I'd just like to go back to the question around the zoning of the OS3 and how we're changing the zoning. Would that information be coming back to us through the process?
Yeah, certainly, Madam Chair. Yeah, that would be something that we would be addressing through the application when that comes forward for the draft approval. But the specifics of what we've done here in the city, we'll take that back to staff and we'll take a look at what's happened in the past, and we'll connect back prior to council.
Thank you, Mr. Fehlberg, for your comments and answers. And I am going to look to the committee for Any further comments or supporting the recommendation to remove this cemetery from the Register of Cultural Heritage? Councillor Lynn.
I'll move the staff recommendation.
And I'm looking for a seconder. Councillor Lewis, seconds. Any other comments from committee? Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just with respect to Mr. Musa's question, it raised the point that these lands were included within the gross boundary as a result of their status as OS3 to provide cemetery space. Is that accurate through you, Madam Chair, to staff? Were these included on the premise that they provided cemetery space, or were these contemplated as developable lands within the UGB?
And through you, Madam Chair. Those would be parts of the future application that we'll bring forward. So that will be something that we'll be identifying and analyzing as part of that application and that recommendation. I don't have the information in front of me at this point.
Oh, thank you. So just to clarify then, these are currently outside of the UGB?
No, these lands are currently within the urban growth boundary. They're within the city limits and designated. They were designated as part for cemetery, and as following direction from council in September last year, we were asked to consider a draft plan application on these lands.
Perhaps I can clarify my question a little bit. Thank you, Mr. Feldberg. When the urban growth boundary was set, we identify lands that are included and excluded. We would identify developable lands within the urban growth boundary, or we could also identify some pieces of open space to be included as well, right? So the open space 3. If this wasn't part of the calculation that we use for land needs analysis to set the urban growth boundary, would they have been included in the way that we set the urban growth boundary? Or since they don't measure in, and they wouldn't have at the time measured into the calculation of the UGB, would they have been? Is this considered supplemental to the amount of land that we needed in the forecast to set the urban growth boundary? Maybe that wasn't clarifying, but hopefully.
Yeah, so just to understand it, Councillor, your question more or less is, are these lands being added to the growth of lands? That,
right. I mean, we've got a net amount of developable land within the urban growth boundary. By changing its status from OS3 to something else, which comes at a different point in time, does that create a net increase in lands within the UGB?
Thank you, Madam. Through you, Madam Chair. Yes, it would add additional lands to the UGB. Within the UGB, it would be part of that calculation.
Yeah, thank you. Quick comments. Initially, I saw this as solely as a heritage delisting application. Despite my misgivings about this application in general and this project and how it came to be, I would have supported the removal from the heritage inventory. In light of the answer to that question, because we just saw through 2 delegations exactly the kind of problems that I'll say it, the horse trading created. Because now we see a very large Me Too question. How come we can't develop when they can? And we are throwing off the urban growth boundary balance calculation. And this ends up being, it ends up being an end run around how we calculate the urban growth boundary and the amount of lands that are developable within it by changing the categorization of it. So I have concerns about that. And I recognize that I'm in the minority on this, but as I said, I would have voted to support the removal of the designation just because I saw that as more a formality. I'm not looking to block the application, but in terms of general planning principles, I see that that OS3 provision as important in terms of the net overall amount within the UGB.
Thank you, Councillor Turner. Any other comments from committee members? I see none. I'd like to make a comment. I do have a question first to staff, which would be, does this, my concerns are similar in terms of that we're doing this prematurely almost. Can this decision to remove these lands from the register be done at a further time through the process? Does it have to be done now?
Madam Chair, this is Mike Gregwell. I can take a stab at this one. Thank you for the question. Through the chair, an owner of a heritage listed property can request to remove the property from the register at any time. And council must consider the request to either and make a decision as to whether the property should continue to be listed on the register or whether it should be removed. In terms of timelines, the second part of the wording in the act is that council must issue a notice of decision to the owner within 90 days of that decision. So it's a timeline that's after the request or after the decision, but there's no timeline in terms of like there was a demolition request, you would have 60 days. This one is 90 days from the decision.
Thank you, Mr. Goodall, for that clarification. I do appreciate it. I don't have a problem with supporting it. What I have a problem with right now is the uncertainty of how this may set a precedent for other lands that we may bring into the urban growth boundary. And I'm just being a little cautious here and will not be supporting it. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's important to weigh in on the other side of this, colleagues. We have to make a planning decision based on an application to delist a property. To speculate on what it might be in the future or what other applicants might come forward with on their adjacent properties or neighboring properties in the area is not the basis for refusing a delisting of a heritage property. And both staff and Latch have said there's no reason to leave it on the list. So respectfully, I understand the concerns about urban growth boundary, about what people might do with properties in the future, but that's not what's before us today. What's before us is an application to delist a heritage property that our staff and our advisory committee are saying doesn't merit remaining on the registry. So whatever misgivings folks might have about future applications or future land uses, I think that those need to come forward if an application comes forward that raises your concern. I don't think it's grounds to refuse the delisting today. So I encourage colleagues to not get speculative on what the future holds, but to look at the matter that's before us, and that's the delisting, which I'm going to support as our staff and our advisory committee have recommended.
Thank you, Councillor Lewis. Any other comments? I see none. So if we can proceed to vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-2.
And with that, I'd like to do our last public participation meeting, which is 3.3. And it is a public participation meeting for 655-685 Fanshawe Park Road West, looking to open up the PPM. Councillor Lehman, seconded by Councillor Hillier.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
And I'd like to go to staff for just a quick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a zoning bylaw amendment for the lands known municipally as 665 to 685 Fanshawe Park Road West, which is located at the northwest corner of the intersection of Fanshawe Park Road West and Wonderland Road North. The lands currently contain 4 standalone commercial buildings. The purpose of the application is to permit an increased range and intensity of neighborhood scale commercial uses by rezoning the lands from restricted service commercial special provision zone to a neighborhood shopping area special provision zone, as well as to facilitate the infill and intensification of an existing commercial center through the construction of a 1-story building addition in front of the existing building on 685 Fanshawe Road West, which is currently occupied by the Mastermind Toys. Planning staff is of the opinion that the proposed range and intensity of uses is compatible with the surrounding land uses and is not expected to be significantly more intense than what is currently existing. The proposed changes will allow for greater flexibility in the future use and intensification of the subject lands, which are currently underutilized, helping meet the evolving needs of the surrounding community. The application is consistent with the PPS and conforms with the London Plan and the 1989 official plan, and is appropriate for the site. For these reasons, staff is recommending approval of the proposed amendment. Thank you, and staff is available to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Wu. Any technical questions? I see none. I'd like to go to the applicant.
Good evening, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
Thank you. This is Ben McCauley with Selinka Priamo. I have no further comments to add at this time, but I'm here to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McCauley. Any technical questions? See none. I would like to now go to the public if there's anyone that would like to make comments to this recommendation. Please come forward. I'll ask one more time if there's anyone here from the public that would like to make comments. I see none, and with that, I'll go to committee to close the public participation meeting. Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Lehman.
Motion carries 5-0.
And with that, I'd like to go to committee for a motion, comments. Looking for someone to move the recommendation. Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Hillier. No further comments. If we can proceed to vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
To number 4, items for direction. We have 4.1, which is the second report of the London Advisory Committee on Heritage. There were a number of items on this that we've already dealt with, and looking to the committee to approve or receive and approve. Councillor Lewis, seconded by Councillor Lehman. Thank you.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 5-0.
Moving on to number 5, which are deferred matters, additional business. I see none. Adjournment. Councillor Hillier, seconded by Councillor Turner. And with that, can we have a hand vote? Everyone in favor? Thanks, everyone. Have a nice evening.